we can come to order. I'd like to welcome you all to the regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, March 5th, 2012. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues Paul Kretz, Bill Rosendahl, and Mitch Englander, and we are ready to begin. If anyone would like to offer public comment, please fill out one of these white cards and bring it forward. We'll be hearing general public comment after the discussion of our agenda items today. If you want to speak to a particular agenda item, same card, just indicate the agenda item number on the card. Colleagues, without objection, I'd like to request that we approve items 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8 on the consent calendar, unless anyone has any objections to do so.
7 and 8, so moved for mine.
3, 5, 6, 7, and 8.
3, 2, yeah. 3, 5, 6, 7.
Oh, 5 was, I do have a couple questions on 5.
All right, then we will call 5 special. Any of the other?
I had a comment on 4, but that I can let it go.
4, I was going to suggest that we note and file.
Okay.
All right, then without objection, we will approve items 3, 6, 7, and 8 on consent and note and file item number 4. And why don't we go ahead and do item 5 now then while we're waiting,
Okay.
if that's okay. So let's move to item number 5.
Okay, item number 5 was a motion, Cardenas-Perry, relative to identifying opportunities for innovative financing and refinancing options and related staffing.
One moment, Mr. Sharana, please. If we could have order in the room, it's difficult to hear even with the microphones. So please, we take our conversations outside. Mr. Sharana.
Okay, I'll start over again. So a motion, Cardenas-Perry, relative to identifying opportunities for innovative financing and refinancing options and related staffing for the CAO's Office Debt Management and Investor Relations Division. So with that, I think staff are on their way over. But the motion was introduced back in December, and it was looking part of when the genesis of the motion was looking at opportunities for refinancing, basically trying to lower our debt service costs for our taxpayers. Recently, the council approved a GO refinancing, which hopefully will save up to $24, perhaps up to $28 million for those particular refinancings. We also are in the process of doing a MICLA refinancing, where we're going to be converting some of our CP to long-term debt, but also looking at where we have opportunities to refinancing some of our existing debt. So there are basically two pieces to this motion. One was to look at staffing, the other was certainly to look at refinancing opportunities so we can save on debt service. As far as staffing, we currently have 4 staff members, or actually 5 members that are part of the group. I think the motion asks whether or not additional staffing would be necessary for us to carry out the function and make sure we get everything squared away and stay on top of everything. From our perspective, we have plenty of actually positions. It's really a matter of money, whether or not we have sufficient salary savings to actually hire additional staff, which actually through the course of the current year we've been able to identify some additional monies, and we actually are pursuing filling some positions. So with that, that's sort of a quick update. We will be preparing a formal report that we will get back to the committee probably in the next 30 days or so.
Number 5, right? Number 5.
This is number 5, yeah.
Thank you.
Were there any questions?
Mr. England?
Just is I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Is $100 million in savings a realistic goal?
That is quite a bit on the high side.
Okay.
So, like I said, with the GO, we hope to save roughly about 24 to 28 million, and then that's a good opportunity. 100 million is a little stretch.
But you got a smile on. What do you think?
It depends over the period of time that you expect us to get the savings, and they're not all general fund. For example, we're doing a wastewater refunding in April that we hope will produce $30 to $40 million over the life of the bonds. And we're doing another GO refunding that will produce $30 million over the life of the bonds. But that's not a general fund savings. That's a savings to the taxpayers, per se. So we're doing a MICLA refunding. I think that refunding is also around, what, around 12, 15 million over the life of the bonds. So every year, divide that by 15, it's about $1 million, $900,000 each year. But, you know, it depends which bond issuance it is. So if you expect us to get 100 million in 1 year? I mean, I don't control the market, you know. We wanted to go out to market earlier this year, and we weren't able to this fiscal year because the market moved on us. So we're hoping if the market stays the same, all these savings will come to fruition.
Thank you. Mr. Englander.
Yes, no, thank you, Mr. Rosendahl, for piping in, because I was going to actually suggest we double it to 200 million. If we get I'd like to see it done by next week. Is that feasible? All general fund, no, in all seriousness, it actually, the motion, as I read it, it says 100 million in savings over the life of the bonds.
Correct.
So you stated that. It does not say specifically for the general fund, and it sounds like from what was presented, we've actually already doing that. If you add in both your comments and Ray's comments and collectively over the life of those bonds, that's pretty close to the 100 million. And so we've met that, and I think it's fantastic that Mr. Cardenas puts in a motion. You guys stepped up to the plate, and we've now saved the taxpayers of Los Angeles $100 million.
They would have done it anyway.
That's why I say, can we see it at 200 million? I think it's worthy of that. I think you guys have done a great job at identifying those savings. I would move that we note and file the motion based on that. In addition, one of the other things is, and you already talked about the staffing, I think that should be dealt with separately as it relates to the budget, the overall city budget. And in terms of putting it in the FSR, I would suggest we don't do that, because the FSR would be buried in the FSR, where bond refinancing should be treated separately, because there are some serious issues and things to look at. So it's not just another page in the FSR. And I believe we do treat that differently now, where it comes to committee, and we look at what's being structured, what the deal points are, and we weigh those things separately, and they carry a lot of weight. So I would look at maintaining the course in terms of what the CAO office has done, and actually compliment them, but receive or note and file this motion and compliment Mr. Cardenas for actually identifying $100 million in savings and already working with the CAO, and we've achieved that. So
I didn't do anything.
if we could make the record reflect that.
Well done, Mr.
I think
Cardenas.
we're-
Where do you want to spend it, by the way, Mr. Cardenas?
Oh, no, he's going to Congress. He'll take it with him. No, it stays here in L.A.
So we get a good idea, we get to spend the money?
I mean, for
Mr.
example, it's not
Cardenas is
just
here with-
about the refundings. In fiscal year 10-11, we actually did no refundings. And the reason was because we took advantage of the federal programs in interest rate reduction. So when we issued a bond, we issued new money so we could get the reduction of 35, 45, or 70% rebate from the federal government. So it's not just about the refundings, it's about taking advantage of the federal programs that are out there. And I think we did that for both the wastewater and the general fund. So.
Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you. I appreciate the attention my colleagues are putting to this very involved but very simple-looking opportunity we have. Simple-looking because basically it's kind of like when you have real estate or what have you, which the average American is probably more familiar with. If you wanted to take advantage of a lower rate or what have you, or redo your loan for some reason, and there's an advantage to you, the borrower, then you go ahead and try to take advantage of that. In this particular case, we're dealing with the second largest city in the country, and we have bonds with various maturity rates, various interest rates, different kinds of bonds, some bonds that do have opportunities to restructure them, and some bonds that unfortunately don't have opportunities, or there may be penalties for doing so within a certain window, et cetera. But the main reason for me putting this motion forward was to, as you said, Councilmember Englander, is to support the good efforts of the CAO's office. But just like every other department in the city, the CAO's office doesn't have as many bodies and people as they'd like to have if they had an opportunity to take advantage of everything that they could set their mind to and their time to. So if you look in the motion speaks to how can we help the CAO's office take as much advantage of these opportunities as quickly as possible. But at the same time, Natalie, you correct me if I'm wrong, does your department have enough people to actually respectfully, calmly, and hardworkingly go forward and take advantage of these things, like in the window of time that we don't control? Because right now, it seems to be that this is one of those windows of time where, due to circumstances beyond our control, this is a good opportunity for us to restructure a lot of our bonds. But do we have enough people, do we have enough time in the day for your department to do that and look back and say, wow, we spent every opportunity we could, and I think we took advantage of every opportunity that could have been taken advantage of?
Well, like I said, we do take advantage of every opportunity where we can, but to answer your question, no, we don't. I think with the number of issues we've had, and you know, just because we do a deal, remember, there's paperwork and administrative duties that occur over the life of those bonds, and no, we don't. Certainly, we need, at a minimum, another staff member in that group to manage some of, you know, just look at the opportunities, but also manage all the administrative work that goes along with all of those. And now we could go on for quite days on this topic, but...
And the thing is, one of the things that I hope my colleagues can appreciate is, I think that what we have is an opportunity right now that the City Council has never before, in my opinion, as far as I've heard or the history that I've understood, I don't think the City Council has ever been this involved in understanding and appreciating the value of what we do as a city when it comes to our panoply of bonds that we participate in. And that being the case, I think that with that awareness, hopefully this council can respond to the CAO, if they're not too shy, to tell us how we can help you budgetarily with the people power, whether it's getting some temporary in-house folk with some expertise who know how to pour over this stuff and bring the reports to the CAO members, et cetera, and say, these opportunities that people bring to us all the time, these just don't make any sense, that, you know, they don't stand. These opportunities may, which will be a policy decision for you to bring to us, and these opportunities, by all means, we need to take care of them right away because the window is wide open for those opportunities. So that's what this motion is speaking to, Natalie.
And I think that we do that. I mean, for example, NICLA is the best example of that. There are 6 bond issuances right now that are what we call in the money. They're able to be refunded. 2 of them, though, have CRA participation. Well, CRA is in limbo right now. So those we had to set aside. So it'll probably be back to you in maybe 5 months, 6 months with those 2 bond issues. So we can't do it with the 4 we're doing now.
And we could just keep our fingers
We'll
crossed to
just
see
keep
what
it-
what the timing looks then.
And we did that with GEO, for example. We had done this before in wastewater in 2004 when we did 4 refundings in a year. But we came to you and said, okay, we want authority to refund up to a certain amount of money and to a certain date. So until December 31st, we have authority to refund GEOs. So we're coming to you, I think in March, with the report on general obligation bonds to refund. You know, out of the 500, we think 340 are in the money. So we'll go ahead and refund those. And we'll come again in 3 months if we have more. So we have tried within our own office to find ways to get pre-authority to move forward. And so we come back to you with the final official statement, which by law you have to approve. So we have done what we can to say, okay, within these parameters, give us the authority to issue. So we've put that into place, and that saves us a lot of time. We don't have to redo documents, we don't have to repay, so that really, really helps. And I think that we've added a lot of programs to the city over the years, a lot of debt programs. Some are more complicated than others, but we really haven't added any staff. So, you know, Ray made the pitch already. And we are not a department that asks for staff. We kind of just absorb and move along. But we have 100 bond issues outstanding at this point.
Exactly. See,
That's a lot.
the thing is, Natalie, what I'd like to do instead of note and filing this, if we could hit the report back in 30 days. As you just described, there is some more activity that should be some really good news to us about what else is going on, even within the next few weeks in your next report. So, Mr. Chairman, if we could hear this in 30 days with a more enhanced...
45? Well, I'm asking because we have
45?
we have
You're
three
adding more work
refundings.
than-
We have 3 refundings going on, and they should be pretty much done by,
Okay.
we hope, mid-April. So 45 days would be better for me. I don't know about Ray, but it would be better for me.
45, and we'll
Yeah.
include an update. As you know, as it was mentioned, we've been hit, just like many other departments, given our constraints. And so we've generated some savings, and we are actively looking at trying to recruit and bring folks in.
Exactly. And the thing is, the thing is, my urgency, Mr. Chairman, is that there's a window beyond all of our control, that if we can actually maximize that, it's better for the ratepayers, taxpayers, everybody. So if we could hear it back in 45 days. In addition to that, if you could, it's my understanding that the information is readily available for you to list all of our outstanding bonds.
Yes.
Just in table form.
I have that.
You don't have to simplify it too much, it's in table form.
Okay.
So we can actually understand the magnitude of what we're sitting on. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Kratz?
I think I was going to say something to the same effect, which is if there really are 100 outstanding bond issuances, or whatever the number was, and we may be missing some of the boat because of the low rates and our understaffing, we should be looking at whether we need to staff up and how much. So I don't know if it was clear that a request for that information be part of this, but if it wasn't, it wouldn't be the first time that we've sort of cut off our nose to spite our face during this shortfall, where we may have cut people and then actually net lost money because we're able to affect efficiencies much more slowly. And this would be one case where that would be the case, so.
Refunding bonds do take priority. It's other things that kind of fall behind sometimes, but the refundings, you're right, take priority.
So then, are you done? So my recommendation then would be to, if we could have the report back 45 days on the first item in the motion on 100 million savings, or what we've been able to accomplish and identify, though we take out the FSR status reports, that this be not part of FSRs, so we don't have to bring that item back. We can note and file that part.
Okay.
And on the staffing, come back with your report on if there's a need for staffing. We'll present that with the report if Mr. Cardenas is okay with that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, just so that we're clear, the FSR portion of the motion only related to opportunities that were taken advantage of, not staffing enhancements or anything else. But if you're okay with that, then without objection.
For the record, does that mean that you're continuing the item in committee? You're going to hold the item in committee?
Yeah, let's hold it in committee, and we'll get a report back in 45 days. Okay?
But obviously, clear on that, just so that we're all clear, is that if it requires support staff of some sort or another to bring in that kind of money,
That's
we need to
part of,
know that.
That will be part of the report
Right.
back, that they come back with, and then that would be dealt with through the normal budgetary process, not through an FSR.
Correct.
Very good. Without objection, that'll be the action of the committee. Thank you. That brings us, colleagues, I think I'd like to hear items 1 and 2 together in the interest of time. Mr. Serrano? And we're joined now by our City Controller, the Honorable Wendy Gruhl. If you could come on up, Controller Gruhl. Mr. Serrano?
Sure. Item 1 is a motion, Englander Parks relative phase-in performance-based budget process at the City of Los Angeles. And item 2 is a controller report relative to a blueprint for a transition to performance-based budgeting for the City of Los Angeles.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome.
Thank you so much. My first time appearing before the new leadership here. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here today. And thank you especially to Mitch, who did a motion when we released our performance-based budgeting. And I'm joined here today with Fred Brousseau, who is the author of our document you see before you, and our consultant in working with us on this issue. Of course, you all know that a few months ago we released a white paper on performance-based budgeting in the City of Los Angeles. The city's annual budget, I know you agree with this as well, should reflect Los Angeles' priorities. It should be a transparent document that allocates our, these days, scarce resources effectively, allowing the departments and taxpayers to see how their dollars are spent, and evaluates how departments actually perform. I believe that we have to fundamentally change the way we approach our budgeting process. Currently, you all know, for those of you that served on the council and so forth, those big books we all get, those, how many, Ray, are there? 7, 6?
I think we're down. We got rid of one.
You got rid of one, okay.
But two have gotten much bigger.
And you have to go to Appendix B, and this is just the way we've done it forever. And sometimes you say, how do we change things? Because if you looked at a particular department, you said, where's all the revenue and the expenditures and the new items, and, how are we changing? And as importantly is exactly how are we holding them accountable, those departments, to achieve the goals in which we think they should be achieving for that particular area. And so I think that using that traditional strategy in this current economic climate is something that we need to change. And we need it on strategic priorities, shared outcomes, and sensible fiscal limitations. And I think it should be a blueprint that incorporates what our priorities are, rather than appearing as a collection of items that don't often reflect the vision that you have going forward. Under performance-based budgeting, services provided by city departments will have specific objectives, service objectives, and a manager responsible for achieving those service objectives. Accountability and transparency, which we talk a lot about. The city departments will start at their budget basis. Every city service will need to be evaluated and compared to other services. And additionally, with the implementation of our new financial management system that we spoke about, Mr. Chairman, recently, really provides us with data we never were able to have, a foundation, I think, to provide with some tools that will allow us to look at the city's budget going forward. And whether it's an evaluation of how long it takes for cases to be processed from the time an application is filed, or the number of miles of streets and sidewalks per year that have been completed, we need to be able to hold each department accountable. And changing the way we do budget puts it all out on the table, and a vision for the city of Los Angeles of what we're truly doing. Because of the complexity of the budget process, particularly because of the limitations that we have in many of our departments, that we're down a lot of staff and don't have the same number of people, we suggested that we have a phase-in approach. We literally looked at, as we sat down with Fred initially, we looked at changing the whole city, we looked at different scenarios, and we really came to the conclusion that we should not pilot, but phase in. I think it's a very, very important point that you made, Councilmember Englander, as well in your motion, which is phasing it in. And we have talked to CAO and CLA and the mayor's office and many of you about the importance of moving forward on this performance-based budgeting in the city of Los Angeles as a way in which we can be much more transparent about what we're doing. And those of you that are making the decisions as to where the funds are going to go, that you'll be able to explain exactly, here's where the funding is, here's what they're going to do, and here is how it's going to work. I was sharing with Mr. Englander on, I think it was Saturday or yesterday, when I was meeting with some firefighters, and they were concerned about why certain things were happening and funding was going there, and how could they do that and not fund this, X and Y. And the gentleman said to me, I felt so much better after talking to Councilmember Englander. He said, I understood where the money comes from and how it works, that there are different reasons for those. And I think that's what the entire public wants to know. Tell us the truth about what it is, and I think being as clear and concise as we can in performance-based budgeting allows for that transparency and accountability. So I'm very excited that you've moved so quickly in putting this on the agenda today, and the motion that was introduced. And I know Fred is here for any questions, but I don't know if you wanted to go through any of the recommendations that you had specifically in there, a moment to do that as well.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Chair Krikori and the members of the committee, Fred Brousseau from Harvey Rose Associates, and as Controller Gruhl just explained, we prepared the report that compared the city budgeting process to performance-based budgeting, and prepared a framework for implementing the system in the city. Because of some of the limitations and fiscal constraints facing the city, we did prepare recommendations for phasing in a system rather than doing it all at once to minimize impact on city staff that would be involved in preparing the new system and implementing it. And I won't go through all the detail in the report, but just briefly on the definition, the key for performance-based budgeting is spending and budget resource allocations are linked to desired outcomes, and a system is established for management accountability and performance measurement. Those are key parts of a system, though they've been implemented in different ways in different places. What we have recommended, there's about 7 elements that would comprise a performance-based budgeting system, but to phase it in, we recommended starting with 2 key ones, restructuring in the organization so that city services and departments are structured around desired outcomes, and establishing a performance metrics system that allows for the collection and validation of reliable data about how departments are actually performing and what it's costing to achieve those service levels. So that would be the initial stages of a performance-based budgeting system here in the city. Assuming that is successful and the city chooses to go on, there are other steps that are outlined in the report to have a full performance-based budgeting system. But our conclusion was that even if only that is done, the budgeting system would be significantly improved over what it is now, which is a traditional line item sort of approach and very short on assessments in a consistent and standardized way of actual performance and what the city is getting for the dollars it is expending. It also becomes a tool for the city council and the mayor to see how decisions can be made to ensure a certain service level is being achieved. In terms of the initial implementation of the program, we also recommended starting with 2 departments rather than all departments at once, so that there can be an attempt to make sure that the system is correctly established and work out any bugs before it is implemented citywide. In our report, we recommended the Department of City Planning and the Bureau of Street Services. I understand the motion now is change that second department for a number of reasons that have developed since the report was issued to the Bureau of Street Lighting. But whatever 2 departments are selected, the recommendations that are laid out in the report are essentially the same. They are to start with a strategic plan for the department, outlining high-level outcomes and objectives, and then organizing the department around that so there are managers accountable for achieving the desired outcomes and service objectives, and then developing a system for measuring and reporting performance and the costs associated with achieving those service objectives. In both cases of the 2 departments we looked at, and we did interview other departments in the process of doing the report, they have some of the fundamentals in place to track staff time and measure performance and account for service levels. It's not fully in place in either department, but they have the fundamentals there, so they would not be starting from scratch in terms of implementing the system. In any case, we have details and examples of how it could be implemented in both of those 2 departments, which will ultimately, assuming the city goes forward with it, be applicable to other departments as well.
We had suggested 2, excuse me for interrupting.
Sure,
but we had suggested 2 departments, street services and planning department. It looks like in our conversations with the CAO and the mayor's office that they were suggesting definitely planning, but maybe street lighting. And again, I think as Fred's outlined, it's those departments that have some already measurable outcomes or some way in which they're doing metrics that would allow us to easily phase that in and begin immediately.
And just one final point, we did review systems in other cities. There are a number of cities throughout the country and throughout the world, for that matter, that have implemented performance-based budgeting, and we obtained information from a number of them, and that's included in the report as well, some examples of pieces of the systems that we thought were particularly effective and could be replicated here. Anyway, I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
What are the big cities that you think are hewing closest to the model of performance-based budget?
The biggest cities, or the ones that we saw that seemed to have most elements of a system and appeared to be most effective, include Dallas, Austin, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, San Jose, and Richmond, Virginia. There are many others that have some or at least some elements or perhaps even a complete system in place. Sunnyvale up north, which is of course a much smaller city, but they were in the forefront of implementing performance-based budgeting. They have had a system in place probably for longer than most other cities in the country. But in terms of a larger size city, I think the ones I mentioned are probably closer to LA.
So many of the functions of many of our departments are very much dependent upon the function of other departments.
Yes.
And so when we're trying to set clear guidelines and be dictated by data, performance outcomes of one department, if you're not thinking of it as it fits into the larger picture and how other departments interconnect with that, it's probably not, you're not getting the full picture.
Right.
We can't, for example, measure what, well, I don't know, general services, for example, in the way that it services other departments, ITA in the way it services other departments. If those departments are not performing their functions, then the departments that they're serving are not going to be able to as well. And some departments, it seems to me, would be more susceptible to a data-driven measure of performance than others. Street services, clearly, I mean, much of what they can do can be measured in miles. Street lighting can be measured by counting, but the function of the police department, it's a lot more difficult, I think, to quantify in terms of specific data, for example. So how do you deal with the varying degree of susceptibility to data that our different city functions have?
Thank you, then I'll let Fred answer too. Police was one of the ones that we looked at as an opportunity to do that, and they were willing in some areas, but I think you're right, depends on each department, but by having performance-based budgeting, you'll be able to say, okay, planning is doing what they're supposed to do. But we found out that planning has been doing their permit review in X amount of, or the days, but it didn't get completed because it went to, building and safety department, or it went to the fire department. You'll be able to clearly delineate exactly where the problems are in addition to where it's successful. So planning department has made many strides in being able to document how they're doing those processes. But you might add in some of the experiences, Fred.
Yes, and just back to police for a minute, that was one of the departments we interviewed early on, and what was interesting there is they collect an amazing amount of performance data for internal purposes. They actually have a number of ways of measuring their services and counting them in different ways. And every department we went to, we found, did have something in place, at least for internal management purposes. There would certainly need to be some refinement of it and some validation of it and so forth, but I'm not sure there's any department that can't measure something. Certainly an engineering function lends itself very easily to measurement, and some other functions don't. But ultimately, it gets down to what the city council and the mayor wants from the department, and I think with the direction given, the departments then can go back, and that would be their job to determine how to measure it. And there are many other cities in the country that have developed measurements for services such as police. So there's examples out there that departments could turn to if they don't have something internally.
I think CompStat, for example, is one in which the police department has used to see where they're putting their resources and each month can identify. So that's everything from response times to, and you may know better than I, Mitch, on that one, the response times as well as crime statistics and those things that then they determine, okay, we need to put more people here based on X, Y, and Z. But that was kind of the beginning. I think that was CompStat we was looking at.
You're right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Mr. England.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to thank our controller, Wendy Gruhl, for spending so much time on this. I know we work closely. We've had many, many conversations over the years on how draconian, archaic the process of the city budget is. And when I go out to the public and I try to explain to people the city budget process, the fact that I've been actually involved as a staffer for 8 years that I've sat through the city budget process, it's mind-boggling, some of the things that occur. or some of the some of the terminology that's created over the years that hasn't quite made its way into generally accepted accounting principles yet, but we managed to do them in the city. But the crazy thing now, and I think it's crazy, from having run multi-million-dollar nonprofit organizations to national corporations to my own companies to being involved in a lot of different financial management aspects of industries, I have yet to see anything quite like the City of LA, where we simply take last year's budget and we sort of dust it off. We bring it forward to this year and say, well, what did we fund in each department last year? And then we're going to look at going forward our current year, what's our revenue or our deficit, and we'll apply it equally across the board and shared sacrifice to all the departments, and now we're done with the budget. That's insane. But it's the budget system we have
Isn't that what I say to you all
now.
the time, Ray? Isn't that what I say to you when you take my money out of my budget? I'm just kidding, okay.
We'll have that conversation.
Yeah.
So, in looking at all that, I know we've had a lot of conversations over the years. I know my predecessor, who was focused on looking at best practices or zero-based budget or performance-based budgeting or strategic planning, or things we could do to change the system to come up with what are other municipalities doing that seem to work well, and what are some of the things they're doing that don't work well. For example, the County of LA is doing something that's a performance-based budget analysis, but they have too many categories, and so it doesn't work. And so looking at those best practices and models, what does work? And in the performance-based budget, the idea that this would not be a pilot, it's a phase-in, and knowing full well it's going to take a lot of time, many, many years to phase in and do this overall across all departments. But to start off now, to start off with 2 departments, street lighting as well as planning department, which have good matrix for measurement. And the questions and the first concerns that come up in this, in looking at it, is what are some of the areas the city council would decide have to be measured uniformly, things that are that can be measured, where the data can actually be verified, where it's quantifiable as well, and that it would work amongst all those departments. First, going back to that, is strategic planning. I've tried to look to what departments actually do strategic planning. None, really. Some of the departments actually call them strategic planning. The Bureau of Sanitation actually does a good strategic plan. They're one of the few. The Convention Center does a good strategic plan. So there are a couple that do them. There's some that call them strategic planning. They're not. They're vision plans, and then they're put on a shelf and dusted off 5 years later and say, oh, that was mildly interesting. Maybe we should revisit that idea. That's not a strategic plan. The strategic plan, from my perspective and the ones that I've worked on in the past, have things that are clear, that are measurable, that are transparent, that are always in front of you. And so I've come up with some key areas I wanted to get your feedback as a controller on, and seeing if a model like this concept would work in looking at these 2 departments. I've come up with 5 areas. And working with the CAO, I'd like the CAO to come back with a plan for implementation, and how long would the CAO and the controller think it would take to actually implement, or what are the next departments to implement these initiatives. But the 5 areas that I've sort of come up with, and these need some dialogue, and we should discuss them and see if they would work as one, and some of them have subcategories, if you will. But the 5 major areas would be personnel and administration. The second would, which Mr. Krikorian talked about, technology. The third one is customer service. The fourth one, financial management. And the 5th one would be city service provided. That would be it. Under each category, there's a few other ones that I came up with that would be subcategories. And I think, again, these would fit unilaterally in each department. And these are things where we have data collection, where we can actually have strategic planning. These are things that would be universal, things that are measurable and verifiable. But again, in personnel and administration category, I'd see staffing, MOU adherence, and employee morale. Those would be sort of the 3 key areas to start off with under personnel and administration. Under technology, I'd like to see internal and external technology goals, hardware and software. And then the third area under technology would be interoperability. Under customer service, I'd like to see training, oversight, and public participation as key areas. Under financial management, I'd like to see risk management, revenue collection, and capital planning. And then under city services provided, we'd have workloads, and then the second category would be programs and project delivery. Now, on the city services provided, the city budget, as Controller Gruhl mentioned, we used to have workload indicators. In fact, years ago, I remember sitting in the budget committees and people would ask the question, well, why is it the workload indicators page in the budget shows the same exact number of documents processed or potholes filled or whatever that might be per category, or under animal control, how many animals were taken in? Why is it the same number this year as it was the one previous year and the previous year? And after that question was asked 2 or 3 years in a row, and the answers were always, well, because we don't really have a way to capture the data, and so we just plug in last year's number, or it's a guess. They stopped putting it in the budget because it didn't make sense to really have it. And so now we're actually doing a budget without workload indicators that were never accurate to begin with. So we've got to change the budget system. I want to, again, applaud our controller for this. How long do you think it would be before we actually first have a report back on what it would take to phase this in citywide?
We can look at that. I mean, we were recommending that it be part of the budget process this year.
Right,
the
two
two
departments.
Yes.
Okay.
I'd ask you, Fred, because I know we looked at that in the beginning, and
Right. And we had initially estimated, this was released last fall, that many of these pieces could be in place for this coming budget year. So a 6 to 9 month time frame for the first phases is what we were estimating.
but if we want, what he's asking is, and I can't remember the data of how long it would take to do all of the departments.
The
entire city.
City, right. I would imagine it could be done over a 2-year process. It depends on the level of resources available to take on that work. And this would be, of course, people taking on things that are in addition to their regular jobs and regular workloads, so it does require some commitment of staff time.
And would this have to tie in with our FMS as well? Would you see that being critically
Yes.
important?
I think it's critically important, and actually it's fortuitous because the new system has been implemented and it offers a lot of opportunity for better collection of cost data and ultimately cost data combined with performance data, so you'll start getting more of your unit costs out of it. So there would probably need to be some modifications to FMS to incorporate all of the department data, but the good news is it's a system that can do that. It has a lot of capability, and the timing is good for the implementation of this.
This just one last question real quick, because this could be the most significant thing we've actually done in many, many, many years on moving forward, where we'll be looking back 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now on a completely different way we approach the budget, which is the most important thing in the city, which provides all the police and fire and other programs. Assuming that we can get this through and get the support on the council, I know we're moving forward this year as a pilot until we stop calling it a pilot and we actually adopt this as a phase-in that is mandated by the council, and we will start that. Hopefully, this will go to council very soon. What's the next step to implement what kind of real blueprint for a phase-in and which departments to make sure we start getting ready for next year's budget? What's that next step?
I think
We need a plan.
most immediately is, and I think you addressed this actually, to get these outcome measures identified, and what we recommended is that the CIO and the chief legislative analyst compile some suggested outcome measures and bring them back to the city council and back to the mayor's office for approval based on previous policy statements and direction that the council has issued or the mayor has issued, and at least begin with those, and then the council can vote them up or down, but get them in place. And then that becomes the framework that the department reconfigurations and performance metrics and so forth will work with.
So if I may, as part of the budget process, data collection for 12-13, the mayor has instructed departments to start looking at basically sort of outcomes and certain metrics. And part of what the department was supposed to submit this year were actually some basic data along with their regular budgets submittal. So I think what the mayor had envisioned and what our office has envisioned, well, let's sort of look at all departments, not necessarily drill down and look at everything, but start getting departments to start looking at, what is the outcomes they want to achieve and how do they measure. And so they were basically instructed to come up with at least 5 outcomes in their different program areas. And you will see that information in the mayor's proposed budget for departments. There may be a little bit more specific focus on planning and street lighting, but certainly department-wide, you're going to see much more information going forward. I hear when we had the workload indicator, a lot of them were hit and miss. Some were actually good numbers, others were, yes, perhaps might have been a rollover from previous years. But I know our office is going to take certainly a focus on this. The mayor's office is going to be looking at this as well and trying to get some of this information forward. I think the one key that I would like to put on the table, in order for us to truly have a good synergy citywide, we do need to have some sort of citywide strategic plan. I mean, you can have all these departments, but they will remain somewhat in silos until we have an overarching plan, and that really remains key.
Thank you. Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you very much. I look forward to this opportunity materializing in an actual performance-based budgeting formalized process. However, I'm a bit perplexed on how we approach doing so with certain departments. Let me give you an example. First of all, in government, we might choose our priorities and how much we're willing to fund out of our funds to those priorities, but we don't choose the volume of the need that comes at us. For example, the police department. So if crime goes down in a performance-based budget model, therefore, do we give the department more money and more officers because crime's down? I'm not done yet. My next question is, what if crime goes up? So therefore, do we give the department more money and more officers in a performance-based budget? It appears that at least in this country and in this city, when crime goes up, we say we got to give the police department more resources, more bodies, more money, more equipment. When crime goes down, the same argument's made. Well, since crime's down, we've got to keep it down, so let's give the police department more bodies, more money, more resources. So in a performance-based budgeting model, I'm perplexed. What do we do there? Or is that one of the items that on a policy basis and a performance-based budget model for the city of Los Angeles, no matter what, the police department's always going to grow their budget based on the performance of crime going up or crime going down?
I'll take one stab and then I'll let Fred do it. I mean, I think, and you're right, it's how you even look at deploying those of you who serve on
I'm going
public
to warn you,
safety.
if I know the answer to those 2 questions, I'm running for mayor.
Yeah.
But I'm not, so go ahead.
I think what it is it's determining either why crime went up or crime went down. And that means you're looking at those indicators. In some instances, you may be able to say, well, crime went up because we had less officers in that area, or this particular issue was happening at the school, that you would be able to say, here are the reasons why. And then similarly, if crime goes down, you'd be able to say, okay, well, we had more jobs, so people were employed. So you look at all of those indicators and then say, does it then require you to fund more or keep exactly the way you're doing it because you're doing it right? And this way, right now, we kind of guess. I get, my sense is, we get this arguments in our own districts because I know in some, how many, I need more officers even though I have less crime, but I want to keep it that way.
Controller Gruhl, you actually answered the question very honestly. And you answered the question not in black and white, but you answered the question with a panoply of factors that should be taken into account when you're determining how much resources to give the police department, even though there's a whole radius of other factors that are contributing or not to that crime going up or down.
That means I should run for mayor, right? Because I answered the questions, right? Okay,
I think
that's
you
it.
did a pretty darn good job. I'll have to ask other people who are running
Just
for
kidding.
mayor
I don't know.
if they might have.
Not a matter within the
Yeah.
jurisdiction of this committee.
Right.
Mr. Cardenas, in this culture, in this society, we pay our healthcare
No.
professionals when we're sick. There are many tribal cultures where the doctor is paid when people are well, and they stop getting paid by the person when they get sick. So there are different ways that you can skin the same cat, and different measures of
Can we
of
put
what's
that philosophy in
successful.
the performance-based budget? Because I like that.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate it,
question, Tony.
frankly, all my colleagues so far, and as Wendy Gruhl knows, I've been talking about zero-based budgeting since I came to the city council 6 years ago, which we used in the private sector rather effectively. We would justify every position every year, and we would eliminate positions that obviously their usefulness was no longer existent. I have found historically tremendous resistance to that concept, and part of it has to do with civil service protection, government workers and all that. And part of the angst that community has is directed at us for running an inefficient government with our bureaucracy. On behalf of the bureaucracy, I will also say, having been here for 6 years in this job, it's tough and it's very demanding, and your hours are not your own. And when you go to the police and fire, you're even in a larger situation, about 24/7 situations, and most importantly, being in harm's way. So all these things have to be weighed out. 2 questions. One, I in my mind, immediately when I saw this coming to this level, I wanted the police department, not because I'm concerned about their action in the streets, but the cost to the city is the most dramatic cost of our budget, is the police. The second is fire. God forbid, both fire and police are important. You heard a dialogue here of how do we really put our finger on it. I'd just like to ask a consultant, having experienced that in other cities, and a couple of your comments about how they do internal evaluation, how would we get ourselves focused in this process this year with our police department?
Well, Councilmember, the police department it wasn't on our list of recommended departments for this initial implementation because it's so large, and we thought it'd be better to start with smaller-sized departments. But it's not to say it can't be done, and it would certainly be a piece of it down the road when the citywide implementation occurs. In terms of measurement, and this actually gets back to Councilmember Cardenas's question too. The important part is that while we talk about crime and the elimination of crime, all the service objectives and measures that department managers would be responsible for under this system would be something they can actually control. So it would not be crime, since there are so many factors that feed into that, but it would be something more along the lines of response time. So the department can control, and the city council can fund the department at a level that would enable response time within a certain amount of time. And that information is the type of information that should be coming to you for under a performance-based budgeting system, so you can make those decisions. Whether or not that ultimately leads to a reduction in crime or not may be beyond your control, but that is something that you can fund and control. And drilling down within police and fire, there are many other measures, other ways of getting at it. If you want to have community policing, for example, what is the cost of that, and what would it actually take to have a certain number of officers, walking on the streets in certain neighborhoods? And that type of more specialized program to be identified, the cost determined, and performance metrics presented to you to determine if that is worth funding or not. So I think both police and fire offer tremendous opportunities for measurement and information that would come to you that would actually better enable you to determine levels of funding and program priorities.
Well, it's great to hear. So I'd like to obviously look at that in a more serious and timely way, because we're getting back into the budget cycle, and I want to be practical for this year's budget and be totally focused on those issues that you just mentioned, we would have challenge. Madam Controller, what do you?
And I was just talking to a Farrad, who's head of our auditing, about whether or not we could share some, because we did, again, we went in with this thinking, could we do citywide, and we did some research along the way, that we could share with you and your staff as much information as we have related to the police department, some of the things that we talked about that would be useful to you, even though it may not be in this first phase, but be good things for you to discuss.
That would be helpful. Could we not share it with the police department itself so that they, in their financial analysis and preparing for this year's new budget, here it is March, we're going to get a mayor's budget pretty soon, that they could maybe incorporate some of these suggestions right now as they do their work? Can we do that?
Yes, and they met with them during that time, so we're more than happy to do that.
Be happy to do that and let us know how that. And the last question is back to the mayor thing. I didn't hear the question specifically, but how does the mayor implement this as he puts or she puts together their proposed budget?
Well, again, we had conversations, I'm looking at Ray, because we had conversations with the CAO and the mayor's office when we released this, and asked that it be included, and I think in his correspondence to us and the city departments, he actually asked them to come forward with performance-based measurements for the two departments, street lighting and, street lighting and planning department.
Correct. Todd Bowie, I'm working with the mayor's office budget team, and we are taking baby steps towards this. Quite honestly, we're getting departments to submit performance metrics to us, goals based on their programs. At this point, it is very much self-reported, so we're getting them to identify what is measurable, what can they control within their resources, and specifically tied to the programmatic resources that they have in their budget. And we're also working with street lighting and planning to begin the process of going through the strategic planning process with them. Now, we don't have very many resources to facilitate that process, but a lot of departments do various aspects of strategic planning. It's just not very centrally coordinated and or captured. And so we are working with them. These departments have done this type of process in the past. And so basically what we're doing is working with them to try and capture the type of information we're looking for that we can tie back to the budget and the resources we have, and then to develop a template that we can move forward with other departments going into the next budget cycle, and begin to more and more integrate that into the budget process and the financial resources that we have available. It will take some time, for sure, but these are definitely the first steps that we're taking towards that end.
And the departments that we recommended in there, and then street lighting, we had conversations with them, and they embraced it. So this is not something that necessarily is being, so to speak, jammed down their throat to do it. They actually embraced and said, we're willing and interested to do that, and with the direction of the mayor.
Thank you.
Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, well, first I thank the city controller and Mr. Englander for out-of-the-box thinking and bringing this forward. I should say I think we don't do zero-based budgeting. I think that's a mistake. We don't do enough strategic planning. I think that's a mistake. The performance measurement process, I'm a little more skeptical of, and I think we have to be very careful, because a lot of the things we do, we can't quantify as easily. Ultimately, for a business, the ultimate goal is, did you make money or not? We don't have as simple a result as that. So, as an example, if we were trying to do this with the Department of Street Services, and our primary metric is how many miles of street did we resurface, there are a lot of other questions. As a result, did you rush the job and do a worse quality job? And generally this year, the last couple of years, they've done a great job, but I've had one or two places in my district where a couple of weeks later, the streets that were resurfaced are still a problem. If you rush the job to meet performance standards, do you wind up with more of that? Do you give worse customer service but hit the numbers? Do you have more injuries and hit the numbers? And I can tell you an example that we're probably all aware of from private business where it's been done wrong, where in the hotel business, using performance measurements, they required in certain hotels, which many of us have protested as a result, their house cleaners to clean, instead of 14 rooms a day, 16 rooms a day. And they first wound up having to not take breaks and not take lunches, and then they wound up having to rush through their job and getting more injuries. And ultimately, they were meeting their numbers, but at a cost that we would never consider tolerable here. So how do we quantify something that has a lot more elements than just did we hit the numbers or not?
If I could, it's a very good question, and I think that it's not an easy business to put together the right performance measures. What we have recommended is that the CAO have a centralized manager responsible for that to review and balance the types of things you're describing. So, for example, in the Bureau of Street Services, what we recommended is, yes, miles of resurfacing would be one of the measures, but the pavement condition would be another measure. So you would want to know that the pavement is being maintained at a certain level, good or better, consistently. And then the number of miles alone isn't the only measure of performance or effectiveness. There has to be some quality measure as well. And those type of counterbalancing measures would need to be put into place in each department, and it would not simply be up to a department to throw together some measures, but there would be a quality control process both at the CAO's level, and then what we also recommended is that the City Controller's Office come in and do a validation of the measures that are reported each year, so that we know they're valid and that good measures, effective measures, are put in place in the first time, in the first place. But your point is well taken, and there would need to be some thought and comparison of the different measures made so that we're measuring the right thing.
And I would hope particularly that in an example like that, workers' comp and injuries and all those factors be taken into account.
Right.
Because if you have a plan that creates a sense of rushing, you're going to pay for it in other ways if you're not very careful.
Right.
The other, well, I actually have a few questions, but the next most obvious question to me is, all of these departments right now are underfunded. So we know they're not run in an optimal way because they don't have the staffing to do this right. So how do budget cuts and furloughs and all the things that allow us to operate with Band-Aids rather than to be completely healthy, how does that all fit into the mix when we're trying to compare an ideal performance level when we have far under ideal staffing?
I guess my response would be that right now, we don't know necessarily what's not being provided or what we could do more effectively. And this way you'd be able to say, okay, we see that it's taking planning department this many days to approve a project, or because they don't have a clerk typist, this is we hear all the time, zoning administrator will make a decision and it's not printed or sent out, and so it takes months for a project that ultimately, if that project was adopted and put through, the permit was given, guess what? Construction jobs, sales tax, a number of other things would happen. So you'd be able to say, okay, if we invest X amount in another person that we're going to hire, we will see that. We'll see the benefit of that. Right now, though, you can't really tell, and so it will show you, in some ways, where the holes are that you need to fill, and be able to demonstrate why it's not to point a finger like, oh, I can't believe you didn't do that. It's, you weren't able to do that because you really, here we see, there weren't enough people to actually do that, and here's where we need to move people around the department.
So again, to use another example, how do you do this with the fire department? I mean, you may be running more efficiently in terms of answering a number of calls per year with a lower budget, so you could view that as more efficient. On the other hand, some of those responses are taking longer, and even though it's almost impossible to quantify this, every minute that you show up that's later to a heart attack in an ambulance, the more likely that person died because of your slow response. So if you were responding in 6 minutes to the same number of calls, but now you're showing up in 9 minutes to some of them, how do you judge and quantify things that could actually be life and death, but we're not sure where on the continuum that happens?
Yeah, I think the point we're making is that you, and I served on that in your seat as well, you're making decisions every day about priorities and what, if you cut something, what does that mean and what's the impact? You will be able to see with this quantify, if you cut more, and the firefighters said, there's just on my mind, I sat with them on Saturday, they were also saying, look, there's a lot of instances where we're having someone who's taking 45 minutes to get from Palisades to Sun Valley to deal with that one particular issue. Well, that's something that you should know that that's happening, that it's being taken from this one to that one, and to understand that. And so information is power, and if you have that information, you'll be able to make an educated choice about next time, you know what, we need to fund more here, because that's a life and death we've seen in those situations. But when you don't have that data, you're just doing it anecdotally, as I'm describing to you, even my most recent discussions. And we think that information would be helpful, and people would appreciate knowing that.
It sounds like if you had all this information, obviously you could make more intelligent planning decisions. How much is it going to cost to provide information in all these different areas? Because it sounds like a lot of work and something that would be fairly complicated.
Well, I think, again, that's why, sorry, Fred, why we said phase in, because the original one we looked at would have been very, cost prohibitive. We looked at those departments that also already had some form of catching that data, and so that it would be not an exponential growth for them to have to do what they're doing, but to really look at, here's, just add a little bit more, and that it will be useful information for them, even to advocate to you all about what the resources are needed to operate their department.
So any sense of what the actual dollars are for these two departments?
No, I think most of the cost is going to be in staff time. We did recommend an additional position in the CAO's office, but mostly it's staff time, which has a dollar figure associated with it, but I don't have a number I can present to you. I think another important thing about that, though, is the level of detail you go to in the performance measurement system. And we do not recommend, in our report at least, a complicated, extremely detailed system, but rather, 4 or 5 measures per service outcome would be probably sufficient, because you can get overwhelmed with this information as well, and the cost-benefit ratio can get tipped. The city of Sunnyvale is a good example, where they put together this extremely complex information system-based performance measurement that gets every activity the city workers do is costed out and measured, and it's great, but actually no one can really use it. It's almost too much information. It's not useful for the city council to make decisions. Maybe management uses it behind the scenes, but they invested quite a bit in it in the 1990s, and it's probably not realistic to do that level of investment now. So in the process of designing the performance measurement system, what I recommend is that, as the CAO comes back to you, they will have suggested measures, and it will be a council decision about the level of detail you want, and probably getting a few key measures for each important service area will be sufficient, and will give you much more information than you have now, and much more ability to make rational decisions, but you don't need to go into the incredible level of detail that you could, but probably isn't worth it.
Thank you.
All right, we have a few cards from the public on this, and we're taking items 1 and 2 together, keep in mind, folks. So our first speaker is Heinrich Kiefer, and he will be followed by Daniel Wiseman. Mr. Kiefer?
Thank you. Heinrich Kiefer, Highland Park, former member of the local neighborhood council there, serving in the neighborhood council budget advocate capacity for the last couple of years. I want to support the performance-based budgeting. As was mentioned, I wouldn't want to put any more labor time on any of our departments unnecessarily, although in meeting with several departments, I find that there seems to be a disconnect. There has been over the last couple of years the formation of cluster meetings to allow street services to make sure they're coordinating with the traffic department to do the restriping once they do their paving and so on. So it's a big city. It's a big city. And how do you justify what monies you provide for each department unless you have some measurable ideas? So I support performance-based budgeting. Walk gingerly, make sure we're not going over the deep end necessarily. Don't put too much time on staff unnecessarily, but let's know what our departments are doing And I think we have a chance to do that with performance-based budgeting. So I encourage a yes vote down the road.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuiper. Dr. Weissman, before you begin, Madam Controller, Wendy? Madam Controller, I see that you're needing to go, so I just wanted to take a moment to thank you very much for your presence here. Thank you for your work on this project and for your audit. If you need to leave, feel free. We'll be wrapping up here shortly on this item. Okay.
And all of you, this is a very good discussion, I thought, for the rest of the week for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Weissman.
Well, before Mr. Englander leaves, I want him to know, good, that I'd certainly like to get a copy of those 5 points that you made, sir. They're very interesting. All right. Some of us have white hair in this room. Some of us have no hair. I qualified twice. Okay. Mr. Heinrich Kiefer and I are both budget advocates and have been for several years, and come to this particular committee meeting because of our interest and active participation in trying to understand the budget. What's happened here today is really very impressive, and I want to commend this entire committee for putting forth more ideas in a very short space of time than is usual for a committee. A great deal of subject matter to consider. I can't possibly go through the list of areas that I'd like to here, but I would certainly point out that the budget advocates are very interested on all of this work. Our white papers for the last 5 years have been recommending performance evaluation. Mr. Bill Robertson of the Street Services put forward a $250,000 program 4 or 5 years ago to bring our sidewalks up to date. And in closing, I'm just going to tell you a little experience I had on Saturday. I was at a meeting of the coalition, Neighborhood Council Coalition in Hollywood, and I walked up onto the Hollywood walkway of the stars, and all, of course, the stars items are in the sidewalk, except I walked on an area where one part of this sidewalk was bent up like this, and I forget which stars were being offended by the fact that their particular stars were a mess. Even our best and our most famous, perhaps one of the most important sidewalks as a tourist attraction in Los Angeles, is being messed up by the fact that we don't adequately budget. And one of the things that I think this committee needs to look at far more carefully, and our whole city needs to look at far more carefully, is this city works on about a 15% operations budget. 85% goes for salaries. No company I've ever heard of, and certainly none of them that I heard Mr. Englander discuss, could possibly work on that kind of a operating budget. We have to change that and find the funds to do it. Thank you all so very much.
Just another reminder, though, we're not a company. We don't make widgets. We don't make widgets here. Our last speaker is Doug Arsenault.
Thank you, council members. I'd first like to say this is my first time with the new committee, and it's nice to see 4 of our Valley representatives here on this council, that we do love you, Mr. Rosendahl. I'm Doug Arsenault of the Valley Industry and Commerce Association. VICA represents more than 360 businesses that have created more than 100,000 jobs in the city. VICA has been a long-time believer that it's better to know than not to know. Therefore, we support performance-based budgeting and applaud Councilman Englander, Parks and Weezer for their motion to institute this measure of responsible government. The city's lack of a methodical approach for evaluating the effectiveness and efficiency of its programs has contributed to the broken state of our city's budget process. By making performance data a regular part of city operations, we can eliminate waste and ensure that Angelinos and their tax and fee dollars are being best served by city departments and employees. We strongly urge you to move this motion forward as soon as possible and help bring about a more transparent and effective regulatory environment here in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And by the way, Mr. Rosendahl is Valley adjacent, so he's okay. Mr. Englander, did you have another comment on this?
I just wanted to wrap up real quick to say thank you all for those who came out, and again to thank the controller on this. This is a long time coming. It's going to be a long time to implement. It's going to take many, many years. But the idea to keep an open mind of it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's a lot of concern that I heard brought up, how's this going to deal with the police department and the fire department, and, we don't measure or fund the police department right now on response or response time. We do it on personnel, and so that's a totally different model. I speak as a police officer. I've just rewritten and come up with an idea of fire stat that I'm working very closely with the fire department on. But the idea, though, overall is, how do we justify what equipment they need? What about the fact that a fire department last week took 17 minutes to respond because the jaws of life was broken and they had to have another unit come? How do we come up with those kinds of matrix? And so, again, this will come back with all that the kind of information on the staffing, but equipment, technology, all those things, and long-term strategic planning efforts, so we can come up with a real budget and not one that's just push forward and kick the can down the road year after year. So I ask for your yes vote on this, to work with the CAO to come back with those citywide strategic planning areas that we talked about. I suggested the 5. I'd like to make those 5 part of the record as a suggestion only, and ask the CAO, though, when we do implement, to come back with what he thinks and they think and the department thinks and the expert think would be the 5, but I want just something as a dialogue and launching off point, if we can make those as part of the record from that perspective.
Happy to do that without objection from my colleagues. One clarification, though, the operative language of the motion calls for city departments and bureaus to be directed to engage in strategic planning and so on. And then the CAO and CLA report back. We don't have a time on it, and it relates only to the feasibility of activating performance-based budgeting in the financial management system within the next 2 years. So would it be your expectation that we would have a report back to this committee on the strategic planning process as well as the feasibility with the FMS? And what time frame would be a reasonable time frame for that report back?
So starting with basically the performance-based budgeting module, if I may, if you would instruct us to report back through the budget process, we'll be happy to provide that information. We'll need to sit down with the vendor, kind of look at what the resources that would be needed, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly when it comes to planning and measurable goals, I think as was indicated by the mayor's office, you will see something for the 12-13. It'll be sort of a first step in that direction, and certainly you'll have a chance then to look at those and then go from there. We want to put a little bit more teeth and certainly more meat behind it as we go forward to 13-14.
Okay.
So I would suggest we move it on to council, and then it'll come back, these items, and the specific information will come back in the budget reports.
Well,
the budget process.
Were you suggesting, Ray, that the cost elements of this, of the transition, will come back in the budget process, as well as sort of this initial step towards strategic planning that you've described?
Yes, Sam. Because I know that the mayor certainly wants to provide, as part of his budget submittal, a list of various outcomes and metrics related to all departments.
And the problem, as I see it with that, is that there's, as we heard from the report, there's always been some element of some kind of strategic planning and data collection in each department. But the challenge here is, how do we move that into directly linking it with our budgetary process and so forth, which has been the elements that's missing. So would it not be appropriate to have a report back to this committee to demonstrate the status of each department in meeting those needs?
We actually have it in the motion to come back in all the FSRs. So actually, we would get the updates. I believe that's part of the motion.
That only relates, though, to the 2 that we're initially starting with.
Right, and then each one would...
If I may, so as part of the budget process, there are a series of instructions that will come out of your committee report. One of them will be, we want to instruct the CAO to issue, financial status reports periodically, to provide information, on salaries, et cetera. You would then insert, based on the metrics that were approved through the budget process, you would ask departments then to provide that information to us, and then we would have to figure out a mechanism to collect the data and then report back.
Is that sufficient, Mr. Englander, for your needs? Okay, Mr. Cardin.
No easy task, but...
Yeah.
Point of clarification, Mr. Chairman. It is the planning department and not street services, but Bureau of Street Lighting?
Correct.
Okay.
Right, that is the operative language in the
So
motion.
Bureau of Street Lighting and planning department.
Correct.
So one bureau and one department. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments, colleagues? Then I would move that we approve the motion, move it forward to council.
For item 1 and item 2, would note and file?
We note and file item 2. Without objection, that will be the action of the committee. Thank you very much. So that brings it, that's the final agenda item. That brings us to general public comment. We have 2 public comment cards from Mr. Kiefer and Dr. Weissman. Mr. Kiefer.
Heinrich Kiefer, Highland Park. Again, I guess I should go back and suggest that early in August last year, the budget advocates that had met for the last year's budget to go over the budget wanted to have a nice transition period, get some new people interested and excited about serving as volunteers for the great city of Los Angeles. And I would like to consider the budget advocates your cohorts to be partners with Budget and Finance Committee, as I consider us to be partners also with the CAO and the Controller's Office, because many of our goals and objectives are alike. And we did have a budget day. We did have elections. We did have 14 delegates and 14 alternates elected. We have 28 members of this year's Neighborhood Council Budget Advocate team who are working diligently, meeting with various departments. We've met with the CAO, the Controller's Office. We've met with Labor, Sanitation, Street Services, Strategic Partnerships, Rec and Parks, and others. And we have 2 meetings scheduled for this week. Additional meetings, we're meeting with Police and Fire. We met with Police and the City Attorney's Office a few times. And what we're trying to do is empower some of the Neighborhood Council members to become better acquainted with the budget, so that we can take a little bit of the brunt of sometimes, I think, what the city council members need to push forward. And you know that best. There's things that are not that popular. So I like to say to my cohorts that, we need to be some in the ways the people carrying that message of the public, of the citizens. So I would encourage you I want you to try to push a motion forward to the council president that the Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates will sit one day and make a presentation. After March 23rd is that we meet with the mayor. So after that date, if you could ask for that recommendation for city council.
Thank you. And in the meantime, I hope you'll be participating in the hearings of this committee that we're taking on the road as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Weissman.
It's a yes on both sides, yes, sir. And thank you very much for your consideration of what Mr. Kiefer has told you. The budget advocates have really worked very hard to try to help this city and give the city a whole different point of view. We are here to help. We're not here to be obstructive, but sometimes we're considered that way. I think, however, there's a couple other points I'd like to make real quickly. We will have the survey reported at the regional budget meeting this weekend. It's on Saturday, and certainly the council members often come to join us, and it's our pleasure to receive them. We know they're interested. Thank you for remaining. Those of you who did not on this committee did not remain as soon as they heard that it was public comment, and Kiefer and myself coming forward are so noted. I mean, it really doesn't help us when we find out we have friends and we have enemies on the horseshoe. We don't want either. We want participation, we want recognition. I'd suggest that this may be the first committee that could put an ex officio member from the neighborhood councils on the committee to bring you regularly and formally the points of view of the neighborhood councils, because I think it'll broaden your aspect tremendously and give you information which you otherwise might not have available to you, and make your decisions far better, perhaps far longer lasting than some that we have. I want to make a quick comment on the payment of those fire debts that I guess were part of item 3, and either I missed or wasn't here. That was a $50 item, $50,000, for which you paid about $50,000 for your report. I think that's the kind of item that needs to be made as a policy. When there are small amounts that need to be adjusted, they should be adjusted automatically. However, know that you have budget advocates at your disposal any and every time you would call us, and sometimes when you don't call us, we'll come anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weisen. Just for the record, as a point of clarification, both Mr. Englander and Mr. Cardenas told me in advance that they were going to have to leave this committee hearing earlier, and I actually kept them longer than they both expected. So don't take it personally. It had nothing to do with public comment or who the speakers were.
Okay, I'll take personally that you think doctors only get paid when they get
Yes, indeed.
That ain't the truth either.
Thank you very much, and with that, we are adjourned.